And good afternoon, everybody, and a very big welcome to all of you. And thank you so much for joining us at this strange hour of 2 o'clock. I'm Nicola Hoggard-Creegan, and I am one of the co-directors of New Zealand Christians in Science. And this is our first webinar, so do forgive us, please, if everything doesn't go exactly as we planned. We are recording the event, and we will link this to our website and also to Facebook in the next few days. Our guest today is Dr Christa McKirland, who has just started as a lecturer in systematic theology at Carey College, just at the beginning of this year. Most of it, I think, in lockdown, so baptism by fire. I will be interviewing Christa about her theology and her interactions with science. And if you have any questions during our conversations, please use the chat function to write these down and address it to everybody, because Sam is going to be the one who's going to collect these questions and ask them on your behalf. And do make sure that you're, I will mute you anyway, but if you can just use this chat function, that would be great. I will try to have enough time at the end and somewhere in the middle just to have questions, but please forgive us if we can't ask all the questions that are asked. We will be spending about 60 to 75 minutes on this session. So I'm really excited about this topic because it represents, I think, a new direction in science and theology dialogue. We're used to very often looking at big questions like, what are the disciplines of science and sciences, and what are the disciplines of theology, and how do they interact, and big questions about evolution or the cosmos or history. And sometimes we ignore the simple question of who we are as people or as persons, and what science has to say about that as well. So this dialogue also, I think, represents a maturity in science theology dialogue, where a theologian has stumbled over the science and has become excited about it. So I think that's great as well. And while I'm here, I just want to also put in a plug for our next webinar with Professor Celia Dean Drummond on June the 11th. That is by registration, so please email me for log-on details. She'll be speaking on a related topic, which is are animals persons, and looking at the ethical repercussions of that as well. She was due to come to New Zealand, as some of you know, and of course that was cancelled. So we're very happy to partner with the Centre for Theology and Public Issues to bring her in by webinar instead. But to get back to today, Christa will tell us how she got here from Georgia in the southern United States of America and from a Southern Baptist background. But just to tell you that along the way, she got a PhD in theology from St Andrews in Scotland and theological anthropology. She has a background in philosophy, biblical studies, and systematic theology. And as well as lecturing in systematic theology, she is the executive director of Logia International. And I'll also let her explain to you about what that is. So a very big welcome to you, Christa, and we're so glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I'm honored.
So I'm about to put you on speaker and ask you some questions. So the first one is, Christa, can you tell us briefly how you got from being Southern Baptist in Georgia, I think, to teaching theology at Carey College at the other end of the world?
I will do my best to be very brief on this.
Oh, you don't have to be brief. No, that's
it could take up the whole time, so
okay.
I'll do my best here. So born and raised in Georgia. I'm a Southern girl at heart, and actually the daughter of a Southern Baptist minister. So not just an attendee, but kind of born and bred in a Southern Baptist megachurch, no less. And it's interesting, it was in that context, honestly, that I really developed a very strong love for scripture and also just for Jesus. It's a pretty simple story, as a matter of fact. I wanted a friendship with Christ, and that is what I saw modeled in my parents, and that really set me up on a trajectory of having a relationship with God. But it wasn't out of a fire and brimstone, which is a lot of people in my context, that would have been the motivator. So I think I was spared from that in some really good ways. But also because my parents, they were in the church, my dad's a minister, he had just some special influence, so that if you know anything about Southern Baptists, it's not the most affirming place for women who feel called to teach or to preach. But having my dad as a minister there who saw my leadership capacities and my teaching abilities. My mom's also an attorney and owns her own business. And so he married a very strong woman, and they just kind of passed that on to me. And so their line of thinking was, however God leads you, that's where you go. And it might mean that we even disagree with you, but that's okay. So I don't know many kids that had that kind of modeling. And so honestly, I see that as so important to why I'm here. And the more I'm learning about Maori culture, the more I'm learning that those who've gone before us are just so important. And so I won't trace my whakapapa backward beyond my parents just for the sake of time, but it's because of really some strong women and strong men who believed in women in my family that I believe I'm here today. The other thing is I've always loved big questions, and I've always asked big questions. I've also been bothered by philosophical inconsistency. So if we talk about the priesthood of all believers, but yet women can't do certain things, that seems to be logically problematic. So when I went off to undergrad, I very quickly changed my major from public relations to philosophy by taking one course on logic and critical thinking. It hooked me. And then I started applying that to my faith. And so here I am, first time out of the house, living away from home. No longer am I the minister's daughter. I'm just me. So I started to grapple with a lot of those big questions of questions of faith and of God, and in the South, especially questions of election, origins, all of those things were important for me to grapple with. And then I also added a second degree in women's studies. So looking at feminism, and then really having to grapple with how does that interface with the church. And it's also around this time that I felt, because I was serving in a local church that was different from my home church, and just kept coming alive every time I taught, and every time I saw young people connecting dots and making complex truths simple. And so because I was Southern Baptist, I also connected the dots in my own life that I probably wouldn't have influence within that denomination. I would need to have influence outside of it and speak into it. And so as I was also grappling with the role of women in the church and in the home, I was coming across different interpretations of those clobber passages, if you will. And when I did that, it came down a lot to the original languages. And so as a 19, 20-year-old, I knew I needed to learn Greek and Hebrew, or at least to be competent in that. So I knew master's work was in my future. But then I also thought, you know what, if I can't be in a pulpit in this, denomination, maybe I could be in the classroom, and maybe I could influence minds there who are then going to be in pews and in pulpits. So that set me up really on the academic trajectory. And that's when I went to California, met and married Matt in between Georgia and going to California. And then he and I did our first master's in biblical exposition. And so those were very heavy in languages and cultural context. And then I wanted to keep studying, and really found that theology, all my courses in theology really lit me up, because that's how I think. I think in 30,000 foot perspectives. I think big picture. And so biblical studies is beautiful, and the ways that biblical scholars are able to drill down into their own genres and then books of the Bible. But I wanted to also talk at kind of a cross-canonical perspective. Of course, defining what we mean by canon and all those things is another conversation. But then that lit me up, and I was like, I want to do more study. And if I'm going to be a professor, I need to do that. And then the Logos Institute at the University of St. Andrews came open, and that was specifically doing the method of analytic and exegetical theology. So after my first master's of biblical exposition, I did a second master's in systematic theology, starting to look at the role of the body and how we understand the image of God, how the body wasn't always valued in that theological conversation. And so then wanted to do more explorations in theological anthropology, doing both exegetical and analytic theology. Quickly, analytic theology is systematic theology utilizing the tools of analytic philosophy. So it's often drilling down deeply on concepts, and this will come up later in our talk today. The question we ask the most probably as an analytic theologian is, so what do you mean by that? and it really annoys a lot of people in conversation. But I found that to be a really fruitful tool and method of engagement. And then working with biblical scholars and asking questions. And when you talk about need, what do you mean by that? When you talk about desire, what do you mean by that? These kinds of questions that I think have they're pretty load bearing in theological anthropology. They just haven't been kind of codified as such. So yeah, that got me there. And then of course I'm on the job market after doing my PhD. I already had a 6-month-old when I started my doctorate, then had a second child right after I completed the dissertation, and then ended up finding Carey Baptist College, and we just were a fit on so many levels. And so moved here January 22nd of this year. And it's funny to me that I'm full circle back Baptist. It's just a very different Baptist from what I grew up with. A lot of similarities. I mean, scripture, Jesus, the church, all really important and foundational, but so refreshing in being affirmed as a woman and how Baptist life looks here. So maybe I'm just getting one slice, but it seems to me that Baptists in New Zealand are doing a lot of things right, and it's exciting to be here and a part of that.
Well, I'm sure all the Baptists listening will be very happy to hear that. There would be a lot of Baptists in the northern part of the United States who are probably more open as well, wouldn't there? The Southern Baptists are a particular breed.
This is true.
So that's a very fascinating story. And did you actually change your father's ideas in the process?
Oh yeah. So my dad and I had lots of those conversations as I was going through my own kind of epistemological transformation. Yeah. And he's also a real man of prayer and humility. And so he just said, if that's where God's leading you, awesome. And then also let's look at the text, and he did, and that there's other viable interpretations, and that he was open to that. So he and my mom are some of the most adamant advocates for women in ministry. And as he serves as an associate pastor in that same church that he's been at for about 35 years, he affirms women through a ton of ministries that he's a part of. So that's been a real gift.
Well, amazing story, yes. Can you just say a bit more about the Logia part of it as well?
Sure, yeah.
And you started this, right? Absolutely.
So while I was at the University of St. Andrews, because we were bringing together 3 disciplines in the Logos Institute, we're bringing together analytic philosophy, biblical studies, and systematic theology. Now, if you take any one of those disciplines and you look at how many women are doing them at an academic level, like postgraduate level and higher, it's really disheartening. Then you bring all 3 of them together and it's even worse.
Yeah.
And so my mentor and doctoral supervisor, Alan Torrance, who has a lot of affection for New Zealand and is a large reason I'm here as well. Yeah. He basically said, Christa, where are the women? I said, well, Alan, I don't know. We need to raise them up. And so we basically, Logia's tagline is, you can be what you can see. And so the idea is we need to highlight the excellence of women across the divinity disciplines who are already rocking it. And there are many. So giving visibility where there's invisibility, and then developing the next generation of scholars to believe that they can be what they can see. So Logia is spelled Logia, and it's based on a Greek word for oracle. But because it's a dead language, you can really pronounce it however you'd like. But yeah, check out our website for those who are interested. And we're starting now to get a Logia Global Partnership here at Carey Baptist, and hoping to do some more networking with New Zealand and Australia once borders open again, to get more women mobilized. So yeah, that's the gist of that, Nicola.
Great. Okay, to get onto the science then, along the way, I think you had a bit of science input. So do you want to talk about that first? What was your science? Because you didn't major in science in any way.
Nope, no, not at all. In fact, because of growing up Southern Baptist, I kind of had a bit of an inherent fear of science. And then doing philosophy at uni was like, oh, are you gonna become a liberal progressive and think the Bible has no relevance to daily living and all that? And so I actually have had to face a lot of fear, just given that enculturation.
Yeah.
And so it was really more when I went to St. Andrews and started engaging what we call their science-engaged theologians. So someone like Sarah Lane Ritchie, who's at University of Edinburgh, Joanna Leidenhag, who's at the University of St. Andrews, John Perry, who's also at St. Andrews, Malcolm Jeeves is right across the quad from us in the School of Divinity, Andrew Torrance, who's Alan's son, and just super engaged with scientific developments. It just really helped to broaden my perspective of the different views you could hold. And then I ended up tutoring. So that's kind of like a TA, but a bit more involved in the UK system. So I tutored for Sarah Lane Ritchie's course, Science and Science, Religion, and the Mind, something like that. So she started bringing in like Ian Barber's 4 models of how science and religion can interface. And I know that's from 1966, so a bit dated, and maybe it's been critiqued since then. But I still actually find those models helpful. And
they are very helpful,
So the conflict model is what I grew up with.
Right.
So these are at odds. They can't interface. And just theology, you know, if God said it, we need to literally translate it, and then that wins on every level. And so it has this epistemic priority, full stop. And so that's what I grew up with. And then the second model, the idea of independence, that okay, we'll do theology over here and we'll do science over here, but never the two shall meet. I started grappling with that more at that level of doing theology, because I was like, you know, and I should know who said all truth is God's truth, but whoever said that dictum, this idea that there are different ways of knowing and there are different deliverances of knowledge. What if there's things we're just missing out on? And this has come up in theology, right? I mean, the difference between general and special revelation, whether or not people still hold to those categories. But Romans 1, I mean, there's so much that can be learned from the world around us. The ideas of common grace. I mean, this stuff comes up throughout the theological tradition. I had just not yet met people who were actively engaging theology and science and saying, conflict doesn't work. Independence means we actually miss out on each other's deliverances, the things that we have to share and cross-pollinate. So that third model of thinking synthesis and dialogue, that actually was a model that I saw done well. And so that really opened my eyes. So this is a new development for me. I did my PhD, it was 2016 is when I started that. So I've been on a journey, to say the least. But I've seen it done, and I've seen that there's questions that scientists are raising that I think theology needs to grapple with. And then I think there are some things theologically that we're saying that could benefit scientists. So that's why that third model to me seems to be really helpful. Now that last model is integration, right? Where there is no distinction, but we're all actually, science is theology, theology is science. I don't think we're there yet. And
no.
Members would disagree. But I would be totally open to entertaining that might be an eschatological reality. Like when all truth can be known by anyone, and who knows how our cognitive faculties are going to be at that juncture. But still, I think that might be where we're headed. But in the here and now, what are things that I could be learning from psychologists, from cognitive scientists of religion, from neurobiologists, all those specialists, which I'm not going to become one. So this is probably clear by now. I am not a scientist. I just see the value in scientific thinking and the questions that it pushes on theologians. It's kind of like the benefits I've seen of analytic philosophy. And the questions of, okay, well, what do you mean by two natures Christology? Is that coherent? Like, okay, sure, we can chalk that up to divine mystery. But can we talk more about that? And I think scientists can do something similar in pushing the ways we're theologizing. And even this morning, so I might get a little hoarse toward the end of this, because my lecture this morning was about 3 hours, and we were doing the mind-body debates and kind of different versions of substance dualism, obviously not Cartesian, but holistic, emergent, different ways that that's being understood now in relationship to science, and then more of a weak physicalist understanding, and those who are doing within Christian theology thinking along that line of reasoning, so like Joel Green. So in talking with them, those students this morning, it again reiterated how important this interface is. Because I mean, I'm talking to current and future pastors a lot in these classes, and for them to not have to be afraid of science, but to engage it and think through what are the positive ways this pushes on my thinking, and maybe where are there areas I need to be a little bit less dogmatic, for instance, on the dualism monism debate, and what do I lose if I'm less dogmatic there? That was actually my discussion question for my class this morning.
That's interesting, yeah.
So, and we can talk more about that later, but that would be a brief overview.
No, that's great. I'm really interested in the movement because I think theologians, if they're engaged in this, are often looking at the science and trying to grapple with it. But what about the other direction, from theology to science? Have you looked at that, and do you have any ideas about how theology can influence science or challenge science in some way?
It's hard from my epistemic standpoint, because I don't feel licensed to say what scientists should learn from theologians. So I'm a bit hesitant to step into that territory. I would want to posit that there are some questions of method that may over assert a certain metaphysic, and I do wonder, for some scientists, I would want to just press on, where's that metaphysic coming from, that metaphysical paradigm coming from, because that seems to be very difficult to test methodologically. But we often are having some type of paradigm we're bringing in, and so I think this is where I think some of the interface could be really beneficial, is to say sometimes theology can help give us something that's kind of an immeasurable paradigm in some ways. And what science can help fill in is the mechanics of how that paradigm might work out. So here's one quick example, right? When I read the scriptures, and I especially engage with theologians who are looking at theological anthropology, the importance of relationship is pretty central. And that's relationship within the Godhead. Now, of course, that's a whole other debate with what are we focusing on, the oneness, the threeness, or the both. But for human persons, that we are intended to be relating to the Godhead, and also relating in a particular way to other humans, and relating in a particular way to the created world around us. Well, I think positive psychology or attachment theory, they have so much to offer us. Okay, sure, you're giving me this framework that God wants to relate to us and wants us to relate in a way that causes the flourishing of all other contingent reality. Sweet. What does that look like? And how can that go wrong? So attachment theory can be such a helpful way of thinking through how, one, our cognitive architecture, and how babies are basically born premature, but how the ways our neural mapping begins to connect is priming us for more complex social interactions to keep developing for the rest of our lives. And so, again, this is a novice getting into attachment theory, but for me, it's like, that's a mechanism that can help make sense of more of a theological paradigm. And I also like the idea that we can focus more on flourishing. That doesn't mean we don't talk about harm and where the theological language of sin comes in. But I think there's a lot of untapped resources in positive psychology in particular. Instead of just saying, look at all the ways we're depraved, let's talk about ways things can go right. And let's talk about beauty. And just that's it.
No, that's fascinating. And I think one of the examples perhaps of the movement from theology to science is in those who are speaking about attachment to God. So you're generalizing from attachment to to a human figure to God. So how do you see all of this being useful for future ministers, and what part should it play in a seminary education, do you think? Do you think it should be optional, or do you think it should be central?
Well, I think it should be integrated into primary curriculum. It doesn't have to be a whole course, but for instance, so my theological anthropology course, I inherited a lot this term since it was my first semester teaching, but I hope to revamp it when I teach it again in 2 years' time to talk more about evolutionary theory, and I'll talk about that alongside more more literalistic understandings of the text, because I know my students are going to come from a range of views. But again, I feel like there's an onus on theological educators to help maybe reprioritize the things we've made maximally important, and say, is that a dogmatic necessity? Now, some of these things we're going to answer yes, and we're also going to have some disagreement on what those dogmatic necessities are. But even this morning, as I gave the two primary views now among Christian theologians of this substance dualism of particular sorts, not the Cartesian, and certain forms of physicalism, not strong physicalism that would be a pure materialism, but a weak physicalism. And I didn't tell them what to choose. I just gave them the options and said, you need to think about this, and you also need to think about, do I need to talk about this in my sermons or pastorally? And it was interesting. I said in that lecture, it's the 12th week of instruction that we're actually talking about the ontology of human persons. I said, even that's important. Like, we didn't start with this. We started with Imago Dei, but we didn't need to fill out the ontology piece, because various views of the Imago Dei can work with various understandings of human ontology. So to answer your question, then, I think, and it's funny, Joseph Bulbulia said this to me. He said, and he does a lot of work in the sciences, and he was saying, I think one of the best ways for the church to remain relevant is to remain current. And I think the task of the theologian and the pastor, and why I think theological education can help with this, is we need to connect an ancient faith with current scientific deliverances. And we need to be honest about the places where we need to be more agnostic, where we just don't know on either account, but not just sloughing over these difficult questions that scientists are asking. And so, for instance, that colors my theological anthropology in such a way that the ways I formulated that, it could be compatible with either a literalist interpretation of the Genesis account or an evolutionary account of how humans developed to their current complexity. So, and we can talk more about that when we get into the needs stuff.
Absolutely. I thought perhaps I'll just stop here briefly before we get into needs and desires, and ask Sam whether there is any question yet that
at this stage, just if we could have the Logia website. Apparently there's a few that are a little bit similar, but we're not quite sure what one that is.
Okay. Sweet. So it's the one out of the Logos Institute. So it's embedded in the Logos Institute at St. Andrews, and so that's where you'd find it. So if you look up Logos Institute/Logia, that should help you get there. But I can also get to it when we'll
put it on our website as well, and we'll advertise you. Yes. So the next question is getting to the nitty-gritty really of your work. You're working in theological anthropology, and one of your approaches is to look at human needs and also desires and the distinction between them. Can you explain this approach and how it relates to more traditional theological approaches like looking at Imago Dei, and also how needs and desires are useful when thinking about human distinctiveness?
Great, thanks for that, Nicola. So I was really excited Nicola wanted to do this, because I know I'm gonna have listeners who are here right now, and then those who are gonna listen to this after the fact, who are just far better read on the science than I am. And so I'd love, we'll make sure my email's available to Nicola. I'd love to continue this conversation, because this is where my next research project is headed. Because what I've done so far is, like I said, bringing the three disciplines of biblical studies, systematic theology, and analytic philosophy into conversation. That's what my dissertation focused on. So in the course of me actually being interested in desires, I went to do my dissertation on what is the metaphysical constitution of a desire or desires, and how might those be Christologically informed. So if you have a Christocentric anthropology, which we could talk about what that means, but if we have that framework in place, how does that then work with desires? And this brings in, of course, did Christ have a fallen human nature, which is a live theological debate? What do we mean by fallen? What do we mean by desire? Et cetera, et cetera. So in that process of investigating that question, I ran across a political philosopher named Garrett Thompson. And Thompson has this short book on needs. And what was so interesting reading his language for need, he contrasted it with desires and then gave certain criteria that a fundamental need would need to meet in order to meet the criteria of fundamentality. And what was very interesting to me as he distinguished between need and desire, which I'll get to in a second here, is he kept using language of constitution. So if something's a fundamental need, it's bound up to an entity's constitution or even their nature. And if you know anything about theological anthropology, nature is a very contested term. What the heck do we mean by nature? And then how do we formalize what a nature is in such a way that doesn't make humans and non-humans so distinct that can't account for for instance, their genetic continuity, but also that doesn't collapse humanness into non-humanness. I mean, that has seemed to be the conundrum to me as I was talking about this with my science-engaged theologian friends. So I ran across this work, and here he is talking about need, something constitutive of an entity. And the three criteria for something to be fundamental is it has to be non-derivative, so it can't have anything undergirding it, no additional scaffolding. Otherwise, it's an instrumental need. So for instance, a car is an instrumental need. I need a car to get to work. I go to work to get money. I get money to buy food. Food is actually what I constitutionally need as a carbon-based life form. Cool. That is one criteria. The second one would be that it is non-circumstantial. So no matter what the external circumstance, that fundamental need has to persist. So you think about in a theological frame, if there was no sin, which again is a question scientifically, but if there is such a thing as a prelapsarian state, how does that function? Does that need still persist? After we are in a sinful state, once we are redeemed, and then in glory. So we got those four circumstances. Oh, and then the other humdinger, Jesus. If Jesus is fully human, which I'm pretty committed to a Chalcedonian Christology, then Jesus' humanity would also need to have that fundamental need, or that fundamental need is wrong, or Jesus isn't fully human. So those were the kinds of things I was thinking through with non-circumstantial, that non-circumstantial criteria. The third feature is it needs to be inescapable. So we have external context, non-circumstantial, but then internally. So whether I'm an incredibly immature human being, and we can date that back as far as we want to from embryonic onward, or whether or not I'm sleeping or in a persistent vegetative state or have certain abilities, that need has to be inescapable. So in my own life timeline. So I had those criteria in mind, and then some benefits that I could already think of theologically. So one, if a need is fundamental, it's required to be engaged, because we'll talk about whether or not needs can be met, but it needs to be engaged in order for that entity to flourish. If it's not engaged, that creature is necessarily harmed. Now, again, those can be slippery terms, but that's the gist of it, is flourishing and harm come into play here. And then finally, you can have a need and be ignorant of it. So this segues us into desire. So desires, one way that would be different is for a desire, we're typically aware of our desires. So I feel it. It's depending on which philosopher of emotion you read and whether or not desire is an emotion and if it has to be an embodied state or whatnot. But regardless, phenomenologically, you are feeling something. So it might be hunger. Hunger might be the desire. Now, in that case, hunger is actually pointing you back to a fundamental need for nutrients. So need and desire can actually map onto one another, but they don't have to. So you could need something you don't actually desire, and you can desire something you don't actually need. And anyone who has a toddler knows this, which my daughter throughout lockdown, Mommy, I need more Legos. It's like, I need more Legos. But the point is, she wanted more Legos. And so whether or not that need difference, the other piece that would be different between desire and need that's especially salient theologically is need is dispositional. So even as I'm drinking my water, I still need it. Whereas a desire, once it's met, it's sated, it dissolves, it dissipates. It might come back, hunger might come back, but the need itself is constitutional. And so here's where that really helps with that humdinger of Jesus. How do we talk about perfect humanity, which is a major concern theologically, without impugning his completion? Well, need actually affords us language to talk about a disposition that does not entail a lack. And this also allows us to think eschatologically. So creatures remain creatures of need, but then in a context of abundance. Unfortunately, right now, we are creatures of need in a context of scarcity. And so that colors, if we want to talk about harms and flourishing, it also can help make sense of like massive concepts of good and evil. And of course, that's much more nuanced that we could get into that. But all that to say, this category of need, you could see why I was so drawn to it reading this analytic philosopher, because it has so much theological purchase. And you get ruminations of this in the tradition. We get Augustine talking about desires, which seems to actually have a good bit of overlap with need. And then we have others, Rahner and Schleiermacher in later dates, and Barth even talking about need. But they weren't, no one's ever using it super consistently, and in a way that I think I found benefit from this one way of analytically framing it. So my task then, in light of coming across that, was to say, okay, I've got this analytic rubric. If I were to read across the canon along with biblical scholars, because at the end of the day, I'm just not a biblical scholar. I'm kind of a jack of all trades and a master of none. I have this much exposure to several disciplines, so probably enough to make me very dangerous and probably quite heretical. But that's where we need the church and other people speaking into our lives. So all that to say, I wanted to say, okay, given this gridiron, what comes to the surface if you look across these genres and epics and authors and contexts? And the big through line that I kept seeing, it's really simple, but it's relating. It's depending upon God's personal presence. Now, that dependence has varying gradations of intentionality, because I think the other major oversight in many of our theological anthropologies historically has been they typically marginalize the disabled. And so this relation of dependence does not necessarily entail high cognitive capacity. And in fact, I think we don't actually know all the things that are going on for those who are severely cognitively disabled and ways that God might actually be relating to them. And this could bring in other questions we could talk about as well. But that basically, it was contrasting need and desire, but desire was my toehold into the conversation, but it opened up this whole world of thinking about need, and then the theological purchase that has, thinking through this relation to God's divine presence. And so that brings in Imago Dei and even ancient Near Eastern context of what an image actually meant. It was intimately bound to the deity's presence. And then we have tabernacle, we have temple, we have Jesus, the instantiation of the presence, who simultaneously depends upon the presence. So he is unique in that being hypostatically united to the second person of the Trinity. That's not something I want to say humans are going to get closer and closer to. But when it comes to needing the Spirit as he walked in his earthly ministry, and arguably as he continued to minister in the heavenly places, depending on your reading of Hebrews, but thinking eschatologically, it would be an ongoing need because it's dispositional. So it's not, boom, everything's satisfied, we are just now all of a sudden creatures of need in a context of abundance, and we have no obstacles to getting that need met. But the need itself remains, because the need is actually our greatest creaturely dignity. And so that brings in the scientific realm, and to my mind, and there's probably a lot of other points of interface. But when I look at how I'm intended to relate to the divine life, it does seem to be different from how the plant on my desk is meant to relate to the divine life. Now, that is not to negate that that plant is meant to relate to the divine life. So Catherine Tanner is a great theologian who talks about this idea of weak and strong participation. So weak participation is going to apply to all things in contingent reality. Everything is relating to God. In fact, if they didn't, there would be no existence. So existence is a precondition for strong participation, which is the thing I'm talking about, something that humans are uniquely invited into as human persons to have a certain call and response to God. And again, it does not have to be of a cognitive sort per se, but that there is some type of relating going on with the Godhead that humans seem to uniquely need. It opens up questions, though, of the degrees of personhood among non-human animals as well. My friend Faith Lady Paul has been working on that too, and it sounds great about next webinar that I'll be tuning in for as we continue that conversation. So that's just me. That's a brief foray into my whole dissertation. But now I'm looking ahead now to say, I want to do more to engage the sciences and the questions that has raised for me in my own theological thinking.
No, that's fascinating, and obviously there are a lot of questions. So all of you participants out there, you can think of your questions. So what occurs to me is that if one has these needs, these fundamental needs, there must be some capacity in the human being that fits those needs. So, I mean, Schleiermacher talks about the sense of absolute dependence that everybody has, which is what allows us then to fulfill this need to relate to God, presumably. Do you look at that kind of correlation between capacities in the human being as well as the need? And then our desires would be also almost like a recognition of this need. Is that right?
Yes, I think you're tracking all that beautifully. So if you go back to the Imago Dei stuff, and one of your questions earlier about how does this comport with kind of traditional views of the Imago Dei. So y'all may know this, but basically the major views have been substantival, functional, relational, and Christocentric. So the substantival was traditionally saying, well, it's because humans have souls, especially rational souls, that make them unique and make them, because typically we're trying to think in two directions. What makes them like God or makes them unlike animals? And so that was a lot historically of how the uniqueness of humankind was sought to be developed. So the functional view, really briefly then, would be that it's actually the human function of dominion that has this vice-regency kind of mandate that has a lot of royal connotations from what's going on in the Edenic story. And then also kind of a priestly function within that as well. And so that's kind of the functional view. The relational view is especially pulling from the fact that it was not good for the man to be alone. And so it's important for humans to be in human community, but then also important for humans to be relating to God. But maybe the image is really just how we relate to one another. And that's been kind of corrected over the years to say, well, no, it's really more about how we relate back to God, and that it's important to have human community, but that may not be the load-bearing feature of that view. And then the Christocentric anthropology is that the true human is Jesus Christ. We have good exegetical grounding for that, just what the New Testament says, but then that Jesus is the image versus there's prepositional phrases that are in place in the Genesis text that we are in the image, whereas in the New Testament, Jesus just is the image, full stop. And that preposition is consistent in the three instances that's used in Genesis. And there's been a lot of biblical scholarship on why that is. But that Jesus is the true human. Of course, this raises questions on, well, how central is his maleness, his Jewishness. Those are other questions of particularity. But Jesus is the true human, and then all humans are meant to be moving toward becoming like Christ. So what I actually like about the human needs stuff is it gives you license to actually bring in the relevance of all of those views. So to your question on capacities, in order to be the kind of creature that God has deemed, so let's give an evolutionary account of that, so humans are developing, and there are certain capacities that, let's just say hypothetically, we're in the experimental realm here, God seeing is developing, especially this complex social networking that humans are having, or that developing humans are having, and getting to a point where now they could actually relate to an immaterial other, and they could become a covenant partner. They could actually relate to God, and that would require certain higher level cognitive capacities. So the substance actually matters for the ability to interface relationally at that level, but it is not actually the content of the image of God. So I'm big on pulling back, because image of God language, because it's so theologically loaded, I try to pull people back from trying to articulate the substance of the image of God, and instead say, well, the substance of the image of God is explicitly made Jesus Christ in the New Testament. So then the question is, how do we as the rest of humans then relate to that true image? So having these capacities for relationship, that's actually an important substantive feature of humankind. Now, I know the blurring of lines with species, whatever those even are, at what point was that tipping point? I have no idea. But it's deemed extrinsically. So it's not that, oh, look at how awesome these humans are. It's, okay, now they're finally the creature that I've wanted them to be. Now I'm going to relate to them in this certain way. And I've always wanted to relate to them in this certain way, because we also have to think through whether or not the second person of the Trinity was always going to become incarnate. And so this brings in, it's called an incarnation anyways understanding of kind of the eternal decrees. And so if Christ was always known to become incarnate as a human person, then there's some type of blueprint, and this is something Nick Wolterstorff even talks about in his book on justice, this kind of blueprint in the mind of God, that's what I'm wanting them to become like, to have certain salient features of overlap with the kind of creature I want to become. And at that point, boom, I'm going to kickstart, talking to them and relating to them, and who knows how that would have worked out.
No, this is wonderful stuff, and there's a lot of ways we could go from here. But I think there might be some more questions. Is that right, Sam?
We could come with questions. One comment that I thought there, and what you were saying, Christa, around sort of other species and when humans became the image of God and these different concepts, is that, and ultimately you do just say, I don't know. And so maybe if you could briefly touch on sort of, is that potentially a question that we shouldn't even be asking? Why do we have this desire to know who is the image of God? When were humans the image of God? And as you said, maybe God is calling humans now the image of God, or as we are, and doesn't really matter when we became that, or whether other animals have aspects of that. And then another question. So we've got a few more general, broad questions around the relationships of theology and science, religion and science. But in terms of the needs and desires, Alyssa asks, do you believe that beauty is a need or a desire, especially in how we relate to God? So let's start with those.
Cool. Okay. So I think your question on, like, why are we splitting hairs over when we became the image of God? I think that's the right question to be asking, because I'm like, does it really matter? Like, if God wants to be in relationship, this kind of intimate relationship, and has moved literally heaven and earth to have that kind of relationship made available to humankind, trying to discern it, well, where in the Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon or whatever, the Denizen period, like when were they not able to have that need met, and when were they? I'm with you. I don't find that to be super helpful. And again, going back to this idea of degrees of that plant, the plant relating to God. I mean, all created things are meant to be relating to God in their best creaturely capacity. as humans have developed, I think that capacity has just continued to grow. And so instead of trying to figure out, well, where did we become complex enough for this kind of relationship, it doesn't actually seem to be a very fruitful question to ask. Instead, why don't we celebrate that we have this kind of complexity? And then how do we help steward the rest of creation to maximize their creaturely capacities? So this brings in like our stewardship of the land. Like, how are we caring to make sure that all things are able to participate in flourishing, not just humans? So I think you're right. I think it's a bit of a red herring of a question, Sam, if that addresses that. Cool. So I don't know what the specifics were on the theo and science relation. So maybe we can come back to that.
We can come back to that, but maybe the beauty, if you can just.
Yeah. So there are two questions that we'll go to maybe after this one about beauty being a need or desire and how we relate to God.
Cool. So I want to say at the outset too, when I give this particular fundamental need, it doesn't mean it's the only one. So I do think this is a necessary feature of humanness. I don't think it's necessarily necessary and sufficient. So that's using some philosophical nuancing, but I don't think it's sufficient to call a human just because they have this need. But I do think it's necessary for something called human to have that need. Mm-hmm. So because of that, I think there may be other fundamental needs. And this, I think, so lockdown highlighted this for me. Just anecdotally, we are not creatures made for isolation. I mean, this is why solitary confinement is one of the worst punishments you can give someone, and why some of the highest rated countries where where happiness or eudaimonia is flourishing are collectivistic communities, people that are relying on one another. And so I think very easily, and this is something else I want to explore in the future, is what about a fundamental need for community? Because I think that has immediate bearing on ecclesiology and mission. So when it comes to beauty, I would have to be that annoying analytic theologian and say, well, what do you mean by that? And then what I'd want to do once we have a definition of beauty is I'd want to pass it through that gridiron. So I want to pass it through and say, is it a non-derivative need for beauty? Is there anything else that undergirds it, or is it properly basic? Is it non-circumstantial? So does an embryo, oh no, that's the inescapable. Would it fit, like on a theological idea, would it fit all realms of human existence? So in a sinless state, so thinking eschatologically even, will we still need beauty? Did Jesus need beauty as the prototypical human, depending on your view of Christocentricity? So I want to pass it through that, and then I want to say, is it inescapable? So the embryo, does the embryo need beauty in order to thrive? Now the same thing could be asked about a relationship with the divine presence, because at that point, that embryo is not able to interface in an intentional way. Again, I don't know how God's relating to things before they have the cognitive capacity. So the same thing could be begged of beauty. So I think, given just walking through that briefly, I think it could meet some of those criteria. It would just need to be a better argument, in my view, of how it meets all those criteria. So it seems pretty important. But again, I think the definition of what do we mean by it, because that's a slippery term to me in philosophy of aesthetics on what beauty is. So I'd want to start there and then move forward.
Well, we can
interesting work there.
Sorry.
I just said potentially some interesting work to be done there around beauty.
Yeah.
Do you want to go to these other two questions, Nicola, or do you want to move
save those for a bit later?
Great.
Christa, could you just say a bit about needs and rights? Because I think rights, the whole discourse around rights might sort of be related to needs in some way.
It's a good question. I've not actually thought about it in those terms, which is funny, because coming out of political philosophy, that's what this the nexus of these political philosophers, what they're circling around is, well, what then are governments compelled to give to citizens as rights because they are needs. So this raises some interesting theological questions, right? Because if God creates humans, and I cat out of the bag, I don't actually have a great answer to this. So you can go ahead and breathe, like a disappointed sigh. But this is an area I'm really interested to look more at, especially related to the hiddenness of God. But basically, if God has deemed or created humans to be of such a sort that we have this fundamental need to relate to God's presence, and if we don't have that need engaged, I'm not saying met, because remember, desires are met, desires are sated, needs are engaged because they're persistent and dispositional. So if God has created humans, however you define that, to have this need, and if they don't have it met or engaged, sorry, I just collapsed those terms, they don't have it engaged, then they are necessarily harmed. Then what do we do with the, it's normally put in terms of the avid petitioner, the one who is crying out for God, and yet God is silent. They want to relate to God, or bring in another church too, someone who has been so brutalized by the church that to even think about a divine interaction, that's too traumatic to even engage. So what do we do with those who can't connect with God and have tried? Those who want to connect with God, but their relational capacities have been so traumatized they can't. And so this is actually part of my my next research program. And what Justin Barrett, who's a cognitive scientist of religion, where he was really pressing me on what this sets up. And then the other theological concerns, because I've given you the human concern, right? But the theological concern too is, does this undermine God's freedom? Does this compel God to act? Which then I'm going to make theologians really nervous, because we don't want to undermine God's freedom. Now, I have more of a response on that one than I do on the hiddenness problem, which I am going to be getting into in earnest.
Okay, so let's get on to that then. Can you say a bit more about Justin Barrett and how he shaped you, and also what your next research project is going to look like?
Yeah. So it's still pretty nebulous and incipient, but what I'm hoping to do is look at these kinds of questions. So what are the objections? What are the best objections to this theological anthropology that I'm proposing and constructing from the sciences? So this would bring in trauma studies, and what do we do with that person who can't interface with God and wants to? And if God, I think on a theological note, we have language for thinking of God entering into more of an obligation, making the free choice to enter into an obligation. So I think that gets us out of some of those worries theologically. So in God choosing to create the world that would turn out this way, in the same way that, well, in a similar way that I knew having kids meant that I was eventually going to be hurt by them, it didn't stop me from wanting to have kids and then trying to have children. So, but by having them, I was implicitly covenanting to take care of them and steward their growth and all those things. So I still made the free choice to try to have children. But once that happened, then I obligated myself. And so I think something actually might be operative like that in the divine life. But I am still interested then if God, so on that view then, if God has obligated God's self to try to meet that need, well, then does that mean the problem rests on the creature's end? And then how do we not then just make the guilt and shame that's already present for not being able to interface with a divine life, not just far more pronounced at that juncture? So that's, I mean, this is a huge question right now in philosophy of religion, and the psychological literature, I think, has a lot to tell us there. And what the mechanics. Okay, so if you have this need, what are the mechanics of getting it engaged? What are the ways that can go right, and what are the ways that can go wrong? I think that's a realm where behavioral psychology and positive psychology could really help me. A lot of these are intuitions, though. So again, for audience members that are more learned, I would love more if you've got books you want to recommend, all of that, because this is what I'm hoping to be looking at for at least the next 3 years. Well, I've got to write my dissertation into a monograph this year. Then next year, I'll be doing this in a lot more earnest. So I'm hungry for your feedback.
No, well, that's wonderful. Sam, do you want to ask a few more questions then?
Yeah, so Joy's just asked, how does this picture of flourishing and dependence on God's personal presence relate to ethics? Is it intended to form an ethical view?
So I haven't gotten to do enough of that heavy lifting because I've been working so much on the theory, but I can give you some intuitions on that. I think it should matter ethically. The thing about need is, as something I'm positing as a universal, it doesn't have a biological sex. It doesn't have an ethnicity. It can value all of those things because we're going to engage that need as embodied persons with all of those particularities. But it allows, especially conversations on ability. I think this is really significant. So just a quick example of that. Right now, in our society, being blind is seen as a disability. So I wonder, is the person who is blind, are they unable to flourish on this conception of need, which is really more of a spiritual conception of fundamental need? I think there would be no reason that that person, a blind person, could not fully flourish according to that fundamental need. Well, this raises questions, and this is a live conversation among disabled theologians and theologians who are speaking about disability. When we talk about the eschaton and healing, does that necessarily mean blindness is going to be healed? This was the conversation I just had in my class this morning. I think we need to be far more cautious, especially as able theologians, speaking into theologies of disability, and defining what that person's flourishing and their relationship to God is. Because maybe that person, and I think there's so many people with different abilities than me who can teach me much more about flourishing in a relationship to God than I could ever teach them. And if that's more fundamental than some of these other needs, I think we have a lot to learn. But going back to perhaps it's because our structures here don't know what to do with blindness. So we don't know how to have buildings and organizations and relationships that can see that person flourishing even on a human to human level. And so we've got systemic problems that are in the worldly domain. But I don't know if if in an eschatological realm, because those structures are gonna all be better. And if that blindness, especially when we talk about personal identity, to not be blind anymore, that would be very different for that person. And they may want to say, I don't know if I'd be the same person if I was seeing in the next life. So and yes, we have stories of Jesus healing the blind and those who cannot walk, and so many things that he heals, but also in a society where their flourishing was completely impoverished, and also they couldn't enter the temple. They couldn't be in the divine presence. Well, how I read Pentecost, the Spirit comes down on all flesh. So whatever your ability, you're able to interface with the divine Godhead. So going back to how I think in some of my future work, even thinking about this, I get concerned with the ethical, when we jump so quickly from our privileged positions. And I'm learning so much more about this being here and being Pakeha and all the worlds that I have had my eyes open to here at Carey and just in New Zealand. But when it comes to ability, this is something else that I actually think the need paradigm could help us have a better ethical response, because people with different abilities may actually be engaging that fundamental need better than those of us who, even because of our ability, think we don't have needs.
That's great. And does that also relate to neurodiverse people or people who might struggle with mental health issues or say mental disabilities? There's aspects there that does it extend in the same way?
I think so. I think so. So I mean, my understanding is God wants, and I'm just pulling this from Scripture, that God wants all humankind to relate to God's self. And like I said, has moved heaven and earth for that to be a possibility. And that relating to God's self, it is about life, and it's life in abundance. And that's what we see throughout Jesus's ministry. It's all about abundance and overflow and surplus. And so the thought that God would desire that for all persons, and if there was something that would inhibit the meeting of that need or the engagement with that need, I would think God would want that removed. Now, we don't know eschatologically if that might not be progressive, because to be quite honest, I think I have lots of disabilities that I haven't even put language to. And there's ways that I'm going to need to grow and be more conformed into Christ's likeness. And so this idea of need, it makes me wonder, along with Gregory of Nyssa, if it won't be that my own capacities are reoriented and made right, and my disabilities are reframed into more capacity to experience the divine life in a robust eschatological community.
Oh, that's great, Christa. We're nearing the end, I'm afraid, because we quite like to go on forever, but I think you might be exhausted. Can you just say at the end a little bit about how important it is for you to encourage women and be a model for women in theological education?
Absolutely. Thanks, Nicola, for being willing to end on that. It's what gets me up in the morning. I'm so passionate about seeing women's voices out there. Theology, it's interesting. So thinking of the sciences have been, that STEM especially, has been very intentional to try to adjust the imbalance of men and women across those disciplines. And if you look at some of the surveys comparing STEM with divinity disciplines, and I'm thinking especially in the UK, but I think there would be some similarity here and in the US, is you'll get, so the sciences, it'll be more men than women in undergrad, and then that gap just gets more and more pronounced as you go up the academic echelon. For divinity, it's more women than men at the undergraduate level, and then as soon as you hit postgraduate, it goes boom, and then the gap just gets bigger and bigger. So something is happening there where women are opting out, and some of that may be for totally understandable reasons. They just don't want to go on, or they want to do something with an NGO and they only need an undergraduate degree to do that. That's great. But for some of those who don't think they can, or what STEM doesn't have, they don't think God wants them to. That's an extra layer that, as much as we need to be getting women into the sciences, I don't hear the rhetoric of, but does God want me to, when it comes to being a scientist? Whereas being a theologian, being a pastor, being a church leader, being an elder, does God want me to? And so I want to say, yes. I wholeheartedly believe that. And the more voices we can have around these tables, I'd love to see more Maori women in this conversation as well, Pacifica women, women from Asia. I mean, we have not done a great job in the West of hearing different voices, and we have centered certain voices for a long time, and now is the time to see that pushed, because the body of Christ is beautiful and it's diverse, and I think it's a testament to the one Spirit, to the one Lord, that we do have all dividing walls of hostility broken down as we are made one in the flesh of Christ Jesus. And so I'm preaching on Ephesians 2 coming up soon, so that's on my mind. So I'm passionate about this. I know Logia, thank you for plugging that. So anyways, other organizations, so I don't know where people are coming from that are participants in this webinar, but if you're coming from different institutions, especially organizations, and you're interested in becoming a Logia Global Partner, I'd love to have a further conversation. And then Nicola, you and I have been putting our brains together to think through having some networking events and getting some women scholars together across New Zealand. So Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Christa. I think we'll end there. I'm so glad that you're here in New Zealand and that you've been brought here on the winds. And there are so many strands, I think, that we'd all like to just continue with you. So number one, we'll have you back again. But number two, I think that just shows you how absolutely fascinating this stuff is. So thank you so much for giving us your time today. And we look forward to more conversations.
Thank you. And thank you all for letting me dabble in this realm.
No. It's very,
I feel out of my depth.
at dabbling.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who did ask questions to those broader science and religion, science and theology questions that we didn't get to. We'll have to continue those conversations another time.
Yes, we will. Thank you so much, Sam, for fielding the questions.